I thought when I published The Sea Lady that I had finished writing fiction. We were going through a bad patch in the family. My husband was very ill. I wasn't very well. I thought, okay, that's the end of that part of my life. I will stop writing. I won't struggle to write. But then we all got better, and I became a little bored and restless with no work, and well, without a novel. I was still working, but I didn't have a novel, and I missed the company of fictional characters. And I had this subject in my mind, but I hadn't known how to approach it. It took me a long time to work out a way to approach the subject. No, on the contrary, this novel took me a long time. It's a subject I've thought of many times because um, the principal character is somebody I've known all her life. I mean, I've known for 40, 50 years. But I never thought I would work out a way to put this into fiction, and it was hard. It was hard to find a way of telling this particular story. I knew somebody like Anna, the daughter, very well. And I knew her mother, but the mother in real life is not at all like the mother in the novel, but the child is very similar to the child. So I invented a story surrounding the child with learning difficulties. So yes, I am partly like Eleanor, the narrator, and my friend, who is the mother, has little bits of her, but I invented a whole different story for the circumstances. But the character who is really true to life, I hope, is Anna, the daughter with special needs. I think I write about women and women's lives because I am a woman. I find exploring the area of women's friendships and neighbourhoods where women are friends, I just find it very interesting material, sociologically, anthropologically, just an interesting territory. I think that when I started writing in the 1960s, the problems of women having careers and children were completely unresolved. Nobody knew what to do. My mother's generation just stopped work when they had children, and they hardly ever went back to work. The women who worked or who had high-powered jobs were always single and with no children. But in the 1960s that began to change, but with immense difficulty because there were no childcare facilities, there were no nursery groups, there were no uh, schools that would admit very small children. There was no state support at all. There was no tax relief. It was difficult. And so I've always been interested in the conflict between looking after your children and having a career and a full life. And I don't think it's resolved now because although the novel looks back over 40, 50 years, I know that mothers are still having difficulties. And I know that in London now, the young mothers are paying enormous sums of money for nursery care and childcare, and yet they are expected to work. It's difficult. I mean, it's because women want to look after their children, they want to be with their children, but they also need to work. It's very interesting the way the father or the new husband plays a role in how you regard your children. I mean, I know that men are jealous of children. They're jealous of children if they're their own or somebody else's, and so you have to negotiate that area. And in the novel, when she marries Bob, she does decide that Anna should go into a school for special needs children. It's a very nice school. She makes sure it's a nice school, but she feels guilty that she sent the child away. But then later on, 20 years later, she thinks maybe I've kept her too close to me. I took her from school, took her home, and maybe it would be better if she'd learnt to be more separate. And I think with a child who is dependent, these decisions are difficult. But even with completely capable, normal children, you see mothers who keep them too close, who when the child is 30, they're interfering all the time with the grandchildren. So I think the maternal role is not easy to resolve, and there is no perfect way. And I like describing in the novels the difficulties, the adaptations, the way people resolve these things. It's a fascinating area. I think that what I was trying to show through one woman and her friends and her circle was the kind of adaptations that that women were making and the aspirations that feminism had given to them. And Jess is a very independent, strong-minded woman, but she has to learn to make a career that is very adaptable, and I think that that is a strength that women have had, and this is a feminist strength, but it's also a weakness. It's both, and we now have women demanding much more rights in the workplace, quite correctly. But I think I show the history of a period when you didn't feel you had the right, you just found a way to get round the system. And in the novel, there is a character who actually, at the beginning of the novel, Sylvie, she is doing one job, she trains to do another, she trains to become a doctor, then she becomes a specialist in the bladder, and then she is promoted to the House of Lords to represent her speciality in public life. And I think that is a career pattern that I've seen with women, that they will start quite low-key, they will bring up their children, be at home in early years, then they become more ambitious, then they go into public life and they end up very high up. But it's not easy. When I look back, I think it's so odd that we all got married so young, without thinking about it very much. And we got married in our 20s. The average age of marriage has got later and later and later. It's now into the 30s in England. We all married in our early 20s. And I think one of the reasons was that we wanted to get away from home, from our mothers. And in those days, you were expected really to stay very much with your mother until you had either a full-time career or a husband. And a husband was a kind of protection from your earlier life. And then, as the years went by, that ceased to be necessary. So the desire, the need to get married somehow evaporated. I mean, I look at my children's generation. Out of my 3 children, only one of them is married conventionally. And I think that's a very widely reproduced pattern now, that people don't marry. They may have children, but they don't marry. But in my generation, we married for protection, in a way, and then we discovered that there were difficulties with that, and we had to get divorced and begin again, and some of us married again and wished we hadn't, and it just changed over the years. The pattern, the kind of demography changed, the age of having your first baby changed. I was 21 when I had my first baby, and that was very common then, and it's now very unusual. I think there will be fights with abortion, which is a very, very divisive topic. I mean, I personally was, involved in the fight for abortion, but then I was very anxious when they wanted to make abortions later and later and later, without the safeguards about the health of the mother, and I began to feel that there was an area that will perpetually be disputed. I don't think that the United States, although some states are very anxious to ban abortion, will ever do it. I don't think the UK will ever do it. But there are parts of the world where it is always on the agenda. I mean, I believe in France it's on the agenda more than because it has more of a Catholic presence here. So I think some of these issues are always going to be a battle. Contraception, in my day, contraception was a battle. There was no safe form of contraception. And the Catholic Church is moving towards accepting contraception, but hasn't officially made that step yet. It's really very interesting. I mean, if you look at gay rights, the rights of gay women, they have changed enormously. Now in England, there are many families where there are 2 mothers bringing up. I know families with 2 mothers bringing up a child. I know families with 2 fathers bringing up a child. So there has been extraordinary change, but there is always going to be a defence against people trying to change the law against women, because it is a perpetual battle. Well, I think a lot of novelists do have a strong interest in anthropology, and they're interested in group behaviour, social behaviour, as well as in individual personal behaviour. But I do feel that our personal behaviour is very much influenced by the groups that we live in. So exploring that area is interesting to me. But I've always been interested just in reading anthropological voyages and adventures. I never studied anthropology formally, but I have a very good friend who did. And I just find that the subject very interesting. What is it that is a human being? And if you're a human being in a completely different society in South America or in Tibet, what is the common humanity? So that's just a very interesting philosophical question. So for me, the debate between the individual and the society is perpetually interesting. But I am interested in exploring the individual. But I just thought it was fun to make Jess an anthropologist, because she's a frustrated anthropologist because she can't do the field work in Africa she would have liked to have done. But at the same time, she can employ her expertise in London. And if you live in a neighbourhood for a long time in any city, you see such strange developments, migrations, communities leaving, communities moving in, and you can do a lot of study just by staying in the same street in London, and I'm sure Paris is the same. In the novel, I introduce discussions of Proust, of Rodin, of other writers who've had children with learning difficulties. And I see all these things as converging on the consciousness of one individual, as they do. I mean, as a human being, we are all subject to many influences. And some of them are cultural, some of them are social, and some of them are purely aesthetic. I mean, Proust was analysing in a very anthropological way, the social behaviour of the upper classes of Parisian society, and attitudes to anti-Semitism, homosexuality. He was very curious about all these aspects, but the consciousness of the narrator is wholly individual and singular. I think the passage about Rodin is essential to the book. It's about ageing, it's about feminism, ageing, being an older woman, and it's the anxieties of my narrator and of Jess, what will happen to them when they're old, like the old woman in Rodin's sculptures. And I remember seeing the Rodin sculptures when I was a young girl and being frightened of them. And I think these cultural things are part of the questions we now ask, why we live too long, which is one of the questions that I think society has to address, because now people are living into their 90s. They don't want to, but they do. So the novel raises these questions, but doesn't answer them. The lake, which we see in the opening passage and we revisit towards the end, I think it's a sort of symbol of where everything springs from, like a sort of archetypal spring of life, which is inexplicable. Jessica is always sort of looking for why things connect, why she went to Africa, why she has to go back to Africa, what it means to her, whereas the narrator accepts that there may not be a link. Now, I am more like Jessica here. I, like Jess, am always looking for why the lake is there. Can I return to the lake? And will I be restored to a better health if I go back to the lake? Which by now is symbolic rather than real. Whereas Eleanor in the novel is more philosophical. She's accepted that there isn't an answer and that she will live with ignorance. But I don't think really people ever accept it. Well, some people do, but I think most people are always searching for where they came from and where they are going to. The lake is also, it's like in Wordsworth's Ode on Immortality, there's this wonderful image of the children playing by the immortal shore, one of the greatest poems in English language. and I don't believe in God, but I do sort of believe that children are coming from somewhere wonderful, and maybe we will return there. And I think Jess is searching for that faith. And because she has a child who is completely innocent and has never learnt to grow up, she is closer to that original moment by the lake than adults whose minds are cluttered with selfish or tragic or financial anxieties and thoughts. Anna is closer to that source, and I just find that a very powerful thought. Yes, I think having known the original person who becomes Anna in the novel very well all her life, I was just very interested in this kind of personality, and also in the kind of education available, the kind of world that such children can move into and then as adults continue in. I do think that we now treat such children much, much better than we used to. Not perfectly, but some of the schools and institutions are excellent and give excellent support and care. But then in the novel I also describe, in the spectrum of disability and mental impairment, much more extreme cases. And while I was doing research for the book, I visited one or two institutions where you saw the most extreme and tragic cases of children in such mental torment, extreme autism, inability to leave a room, no physical problems, but extreme mental stress. And I so admire the people who work on these problems. In the novel, Anna's condition is a very stable condition, rather like Down syndrome. It's stable, it's not progressive. She has no extreme manifestations apart from anxiety, occasional anxiety. I just find that whole area of impairment that's not physical, and some of it is an illness, some of it is schizophrenia, some of it is manic depression, we call it now bipolar condition. Some of it is undiagnosable, is just mysterious mental affliction. And I just find these conditions very, very moving. And we've all known people who have been in states like that. And so in the novel, you have a kind of range of different conditions. And I was interested in exploring the history of the treatment of these conditions. The words changed. I mean, when I was young, you called children who had Down syndrome, you called them Mongol. And you very rarely hear the word now. People who had cerebral palsy, we called them spastics. And you used to yell as a term of abuse, spastic. You don't do that now. But there is also a discussion in the book about how the word idiot is impossible because it sounds terrible, but there isn't a good word. And I think I also use the phrase les enfants du bon Dieu, which is used in English occasionally, and it just means simple people who have a straight line to God because nothing intervenes. And it's very hard, but it's hard to find a good word that is. So I think the term "this child has special needs," which is the phrase we use in English. I don't know what you use in French, but the child has special needs. I think that's good because special is quite a good word, and the needs are special. They need protection. They need care in certain situations, but not in all situations. They need a certain kind of education. So we keep on looking for language that is more accepting and more positive. There is a real technical narrative problem in writing about a character like Anna to whom nothing much will happen. Bad things can happen. She could be ill and die, or she could have an accident, or she could be abused, but most of these people go through their life without these extreme incidents happening to them. So to describe the daily life is a challenge in itself. I mean, in Dostoevsky's The Idiot, you have a very extreme character, and people have written about epileptics who have very extreme, but Anna is never going to have that. She's going to be on a smoother path all the way through, which is very hard to dramatise. And I find that quite challenging, but very interesting as a writer, to see if you can characterise her sufficiently and describe the things that do give her great pleasure. She gets great pleasure from pleasing her mother and from being with friends and from some kinds of cultural experience, not reading and writing, but from film, television, and swimming. It's very interesting creating a world for a person who isn't really developing or going anywhere. But when you think of the writers who've written about mental illness, I mean, there are some very interesting examples. I mentioned very briefly Kenzaburo Oe, the Japanese writer, who had a son with extreme brain damage, and he wrote about that obsessively. The child couldn't protest. I don't know what the mother thought. Nobody said what the mother thought. But he almost made a career of writing about this extreme tragedy. And I didn't want to write that kind of book. I wanted to write a normalising book. A normalising book. What I feel now, looking back, this wasn't an intention of mine, but looking back, I think I have written about a person like Anna in a way that only a woman would have thought of doing. When men write about mental aberration or simple people, apart from Wordsworth, who wrote wonderfully about the idiot boy, I mean, he understood parent-child relationships very well, but most of the men who write about this situation choose extreme examples, they're melodramatic, they're tragic, or they taboo it and ignore it altogether. So I think that the story I tell is possibly unique in being the woman's story of what it is to know or to care for or to be with a child like Anna. It's a woman's story about maternal affection, which is stronger than any taboo. To me, that was a very important subject to write about, because I've witnessed it. And I think many of us know people who have devoted so much care, and fathers too, but it's the woman's story rather than the father's story, I feel. Sylvia Plath was of my generation. She was slightly older. I met her once. She was at the same college in Cambridge as me, just before me. I read her poems and I thought she was a very great poet. I do believe she is one of the greatest poets of the century. She had 2 children. She had extreme mental problems. And when she committed suicide, I think a kind of wave of fear went through my generation, because she had been the person who was going ahead. She was writing, she was looking into the depths of herself. Her last poems about her children are almost unbearably moving. And as we know, when she committed suicide, she took care that the children should not die with her. I mean, I do know people who killed their children at the same time as themselves, but it's as though she wanted the future to exist, although she hadn't the strength to go there. And to us, to all of us, it was saying, in a way, it was saying, go on, don't give up. I can't go, you go on. And I think about that a lot. I mean, I know the house she died in, I know the neighbourhood. And there's a poet in the novel, a male poet, who attempts suicide in the very square where Sylvia Plath died, or the little side street. And he is a tragic character. He will never, ever recover. but he doesn't die, he goes on. And I feel I was exploring that territory of survival. And Sylvia Plath, well, she survived as a great poet, but in life it was too intense for her. And I think that was something to do with the position of women at that point in history. She was extremely ambitious, extremely clever, wonderful grades at university, married a very charismatic, very great poet, and it was too much. It was too much. She gave up under the stress. There was an echo of Virginia Woolf there, though I don't think Sylvia Plath was as mad as Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf heard voices. I don't think Sylvia Plath did hear voices, but she was pushed to an extreme that was intolerable. And I think a lot of women have felt that. I think women with small children often feel it. But most of us carry on. Yes, Eleanor is certainly a very discreet narrator, and my publisher was rather keen for me to say more, and I said, no, the point about Eleanor is that we don't really know her very well. She's like a chorus, she's the collective voice of the neighbourhood. She prefers to say we than I, but then you can read a little of her sadness, of her, she has lost her husband, she's fed up with her job, which is no longer the kind of idealistic job she thought it was. So you can read her history hidden behind the novel, but I didn't want her to be a central character at all. I wanted her to be just a sort of a voice commenting from far away. And also, I may say, she's very English, in that English people, on the whole, unless they're in novels, don't talk about themselves very much. And there's a very English reticence about Eleanor, which is not going to complain, is not going to tell her story, is not going to intrude in Jess's life. And she's even worried about helping her friend Jess in case Jess thinks she's being intrusive. And I think that that is, well, maybe all nations have it, but it's a very English thing, feeling you should know your limits, your demarcation. So in a way the novel is a portrayal of a neighbourhood, a region where people are friends, but they all have their own privacy to withdraw in. And Eleanor is a very withdrawn narrator. Yes, I mean Eleanor she's kind of like Prospero in The Tempest. I was very pleased when I thought that she will do the driving, because it's a good metaphor of her telling the story, and I was very pleased when I had Jess and somebody she'd known long before sitting in the back of the car telling the story, and she's just listening in to their story. There's someone asleep in the front of the car, there's these two going through their past history in the back, and she just feels in control of them. And in a way, that's how the narrator of a novel feels, that you can control your characters, and then they do something you don't want, and they do something you don't want, and also they do something that you don't understand or know about. And I think Eleanor, at the end of the book, admits that she will never know what Jess and the father of the child got up to. She will never, ever know. It's private sexual behaviour. And there are things about our closest friends that we never know. So Eleanor as narrator is not omniscient, but she is at times in charge of the plot. I'm working on another novel now. I don't know if I'll ever finish it, but because I'm writing very, very slowly now. I take on journalistic jobs which I do very fast and complete and enjoy, but the novel develops so slowly. And then I think, what's the hurry? I can spend the rest of my life writing this novel. It doesn't matter if it goes very, very slow. The characters grow and develop, and I do 200 words, and then nothing for a week. So I'm quite enjoying working slowly now.